Good morning. Thank you for joining me today for this interview for my virus ecology class. And just get started, maybe you could tell me a little bit about the research projects that are going on in your lab right now.
Sure. My lab has a lot of really different projects going on right now. Everything uh, from sort of phage ecology in the oceans to larger scale marine biodiversity surveys to plant virology, insect virology, people contamination, and ways of tracking that. And then animal disease, particularly sea turtles and sea lions. So we kind of have a lot of different projects, but we use the same general techniques to look at all of them, which are mostly purifying virus particles and sequencing.
Great. Um, so as scientists, we know that scientists, especially in academia, wear a lot of different hats, sometimes at the same time. So maybe you could tell me a bit about like what you enjoy the most about your job, what part you enjoy the most.
I think if you'd asked me this question a few years ago, I would have said that I love the lab work the best, but unfortunately now I'm not doing so much of that anymore. So I guess my answers are still sort of field work when I get to do it. I think that's one of the best parts of being an oceanographer is that we still actually get to go out in the field sometimes. And then on sort of day to day, it's really working with students and mentoring students because they're the ones kind of doing all the exciting stuff, and I just get to sit there and watch them and try to not slow them down.
Is your lab primarily graduate student and postdoc? Do you have undergraduates in your lab as well?
Yeah, we have a couple undergraduates. Typically, we have between 2 and 4 undergrads, depending on the time. I also have 7 graduate students right now and a couple of postdocs. So we're fairly large. I love having undergrads in the lab, even though our college is just a graduate college, so I only teach graduate students. But undergrads in the lab are so much fun because they're just really excited about everything, and they sort of haven't gotten disgruntled like senior graduate students do. Even right now, all summer and this semester, we actually even have a high schooler in our lab, and she's just doing incredibly.
That's awesome. Um, yeah, my lab is relatively small, so we don't have many. In fact, we got our first few undergrads that we've had during my tenure as a graduate student recently, but they're kind of working on a separate project, so I don't get to interact with them much, unfortunately. Um, but I understand where you're coming from there because I come from an primarily undergraduate institution, so I didn't really know what a grad student did for a long time.
Yeah, and I feel like all my research opportunities as an undergrad are what got me into the right PhD program and helped me figure out what direction I wanted to go in. And so I want to be able to give that experience to as many students as possible.
Absolutely, yeah, I 100% agree with you there. I feel the same way about where I came from. Um, so, along with your interests in are obviously varied in throughout virology and genomics and microbiology in general. What keeps you interested in those topics?
I think one of the best things about this field, or most exciting things about this field, is how much we don't know, and the fact that we can work on all these different avenues and we're always finding something new. And it's kind of mind boggling to me that, pretty much on a fairly regular basis, we're discovering the first viruses that have been known in a certain species or completely brand new types of phage that we've never seen before. And to me, that's really exciting. I don't think I would do well on a very sort of focused project where, I've been studying the same thing for 30 years down the line. I really like kind of learning new fields, and taking skills from one field and applying them to another field, and just kind of thinking about things really broadly.
So what is it that got you interested in virology in the first place? Then what?
I've always been interested in marine biology since I was a kid, kind of like many kids. And then I did my undergrad. When I started out, I was focusing on marine biology until my second year when I took a microbiology class, just sort of the standard microbiology class that everyone has to do, where you get to identify your unknowns and figure out what they are. And I had an incredible TA in that class, and he was a grad student working on discovery of like new natural products for antimicrobials from Antarctic sponges. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I started volunteering in the lab with him, and it was kind of all downhill from there because I got more and more interested in research, and I think by the end I was kind of, I felt like I was ready for grad school. I was more like a grad student. And so based on that experience, I applied for a research experience for undergraduates, an RU program. I was in Florida at the time, but I got accepted into an RU at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. And I had a chance to work for Farouk Azam, who is like the god of marine microbiology, or one of them. And he actually paired me up with his then postdoc, Forrest Rower, and I worked with him on sequencing one of the first marine phages that was ever sequenced. And I knew nothing when I went into that lab. I remember the very first day, Forrest gave me like just a typical like a QIAGEN kit to do some DNA extractions for, but I'd never actually used the pipettes that they had. And so like I dialed them all to the wrong values. I had no idea what I was doing, and it failed horribly. But I loved it, and I came back the next day and kept doing it. And then, way further down the line, Forrest, who was kind of one of the first people I worked with in the lab, ended up being my PhD advisor, and I sort of never looked back.
It's interesting. When I was scanning through your website the other day, and I saw that Forrest was your PhD advisor, and I actually have his book in my backpack right now that I've been reading. Just so happened.
The very, very small world.
Yeah, definitely. So rewinding back before you took that microbiology class in undergrad, what really inspired you to pursue a career in science? You kind of alluded to your interest in marine biology.
Yeah, so I think in some ways I was maybe biased towards the start because both my parents are scientists by training, and my dad is a food scientist, and my mom trained as a geneticist and then kind of coordinated the science labs in my high school. And so I think because they were so interested in it, I had a lot of opportunities to do like science clubs and visit museums and aquariums and all of that stuff. But I think for me, the marine science was really pushed forward through involvement with Girl Scouts, because I was a Girl Scout from as early as I could be, all the way through, and I'm still really involved with them today. And they have, at the time, they have these trips called Wider Opportunities, where you could like apply and you would go for a couple weeks in the summer and experience something. And I did an aquatic science research on the Great Lakes with Girl Scouts, and then I also worked on a sea turtle nesting project in North Carolina. And I think those experiences were really key to me to see, here are people in these careers, this is what they get to do every day, isn't that exciting? And I kind of fell in love with it, even though I didn't know about the microbiology side at all then. I think that was what hooked me into science.
And then fast forwarding from there, what influenced your decision to stay in academia?
I know this might sound a little strange, but I kind of never thought about doing anything else. I think, growing up, my teachers and even in undergrad and grad school, like various professors or mentors were just so important to me, right? Like it absolutely changed my life or made my life what it is now. And I think that our jobs are incredible, right? And you always see on, social media, or you hear people talking about how hard it is and how hard we work and all these things. And we work really hard, right? But I can't imagine not doing this. Like, I love that I get to show up. I decide what I want to work on. I'm completely excited about everything that's going on, in my lab, and that sort of freedom to actually do what interests you the most is something that most people never get out of a job. And I particularly love the teaching aspect and sort of training, the next generation of scientists, but also benefiting from them so much by bringing together all these perspectives.
Awesome. You mentioned, when you're talking there, you mentioned about social media, and it kind of brings me to my next question about outreach. And obviously social media is not the only form of outreach you do. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the outreach that you've done and what you enjoy the most?
Yeah, sure. So I love outreach in general. I know it's one of those things that is incorporated into every federal grant, right? Because federal grant dollars pay for the research. But for me, it's also one of my favorite things to do. And most of my outreach, I do a lot of different things, but most of my outreach focuses on young girls and getting girls interested in STEM, as well as sort of encouraging them to keep moving forward in STEM. And I think that's just, because of who I am and how I was influenced early on. So I'm very involved with Girl Scouts still. We run a lot of marine science and technology workshops for Girl Scouts. We've actually built and outfitted a marine science lab at the local Girl Scout camp, and so we take troops there. Today, in fact, we're going over to Girls Incorporated of Pinellas to do some kind of fun, crazy science experiments and get them interested in our big St. Petersburg Science Festival that's coming on about 3 weeks. Yeah, we do a lot of it. I kind of love all of it, to be honest. I really like the things where you get to interact, sort of one-on-one with the kids and sort of help change their view of what a scientist is and help them see that that could be them in the future.
That's awesome. Now, obviously, all of this work takes a lot of time, and you mentioned that you hear it all the time. Scientists say we work all the time, we work hard, and it's true. Maybe could you talk a little bit about how your career has impacted your personal life and how the two mesh together? Or
yeah, I saw this question. It was the hardest one that you sent me the other day, and I wasn't quite sure how I was gonna answer it. I thought a lot about it. People talk a lot about like a work life balance, and I agree that everybody needs to kind of balance their different priorities. But I feel like we only have one life, right? So your work is part of your life, and especially in a case like mine, I love my work, right? And so it's a very important part of my life. And I don't sort of have this distinction. There are times that, like, I have a grant deadline on Friday. I'm doing a lot more work than outside living this week, right?
Yeah.
But then there are plenty of times where having the flexibility of our schedule lets me do other things. Travel opportunities are incredible, networking, and just making friends. So I don't see like scientific networking as something distinct from making friends and socializing, right? And so I think the more that we start to think about our one life and how we want to divide our time, I think that will help people. There's no doubt that it does take a lot of time, but anything we love, we put a lot of time into, whether it's a hobby or in this case, it just happens to be our job, which is even more convenient, right?
Yeah. As we're wrapping up here, do you have any stories that from maybe the field, from rewarding experiences in a conference or something like that you'd like to share?
There are a ton of rewarding stories, but I think I'll tell you the sort of funniest one, or what I see as the funniest one, which is just kind of how my research evolved to where it is now. And certainly, I think this has been a big lesson that I keep learning over and over and over. It's fine to make sort of a 5-year plan of what sort of research you want to be doing, but when I look at where I am now compared to where I was 5 years ago, I think it was completely unpredictable, like the paths that the research would take. So when I started graduate school, I was really interested in marine viruses, and that was what I started. That, in fact, was my project. And we were using all these techniques to concentrate large volumes of viruses out of seawater and sequence and everything. And, that was what I signed up for, right? Like long hours on a beach or on a boat, filtering, concentrating, bringing it back to lab, figuring out all this stuff. And then one day, my boss came into the lab and told me that he thought it would be really cool if we sequenced viruses out of human waste. And all of a sudden, now I was working on fecal phage and spending lots of time in, restrooms or biosafety cabinets as opposed to on the beach. And then that project actually was, in the end, what led me into plant viruses, because we went into human samples, thinking we were going to identify viruses that infect people or even phage that infect that bacteria. But in fact, what we found was that one of the most abundant viruses in human feces is actually a plant virus, the pepper virus. And so kind of that unexpected finding, I think, was so amazing. And it really was what got me into the field of plant virology and starting to think about that avenue. And so, neither of those things, sort of more the medical public health view or the plant virology field, was anything that had ever crossed this marine microbiologist's mind. But I think you just have to go where the research takes you, and it's often to some really interesting places.
And so, would you like to leave with any advice for whether it be budding scientists coming out of high school, or undergraduates or graduate students thinking about careers in academia?
I think my biggest advice would be to say yes. It's maybe a little ironic because I'm constantly telling myself I need to say no to more things, but I really think, all the times that I've said yes, great things have come out of it. And so you just need to take advantage of every opportunity and try to not limit yourself too much, because you never know where those great collaborators or great friends or great projects or great results are going to come from. So especially for sort of younger students, kids coming out of high school, just volunteer. Your time is so valuable. And so any experience you can get will help you figure out what you want to do, but possibly even more importantly, will help you figure out what you don't want to do, right? Which will guide you in the right direction.
Yeah, I understand that one. Great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to letting me interview you.